Okay, let's just remind you yet again, the second midterm is Monday, same time, same place. Bring a pencil. Anything else? 30 multiple choice questions. Should be very similar to the previous second midterms, the ones that are up on the web and you can look at and take. It will cover, well, the whole semester to this point, including a little bit of airplanes, which I'll get to today. But it will try to emphasize material since the first midterm so that it's a little heavier on fluidy stuff than it is on springs and carousels. Any questions about the midterm or things related to it? Okay. So looking at airflow around a ball, Reynolds number matters. I hate to say that because it sounds like Reynolds number is jargon to an extent. I'll remind you what Reynolds number is, and that is it's the measure of inertial effects divided by viscous effects. So what's worth remembering, if anything, about the Reynolds number is the higher the Reynolds number is, the more inertia tends to dominate the flow, and therefore the more likely you are to have turbulence. Inertia is the friend of turbulence. The smaller the Reynolds number is, the more viscous effects dominate the flow, and the more likely it is to be laminar, smooth, orderly. Viscosity is an ordering effect, and so that's the trade-off. At low Reynolds number, you tend to get laminar. High Reynolds number, you tend to get turbulent flow. The transition is somewhere maybe around 2,000, Reynolds number being just a number. But that isn't very important. It's not very exact. It's a rough thing in any case. So with that in mind, what I'm trying to do with balls is work from low Reynolds number to high Reynolds number. Since if I'm going to talk about a baseball, which is what I keep putting up here, the baseball is fixed. It's a certain size and characteristics. So some of the aspect, and we're worrying about air going by it, we don't have a lot to work with. The viscosity of air is the viscosity of air. The size of the baseball is the size of the baseball. It represents an obstacle for the air. It defines the size of that obstacle. The density of the air is fixed. What else is there? The speed. All that's left really to play with is speed. And in order to get a very low Reynolds number, you go to very low speeds. So in effect, I'm talking about the story of going from very slow-moving baseball to a very fast-moving baseball. And as we do that, things change. If you change the ball, you change sort of where the divisions occur, but the same story shows up. So questions about what I just said? I'm trying to get it clean, but I rambled it a bit. So I showed you last time, I can wheel back to that for a second. It's in here. That if the baseball is going slow enough so that the Reynolds number is so low that viscosity wins, you get beautiful laminar flow around the ball the whole way. This is more of a hypothetical situation than real because the baseball can't go that slow. We're talking really slow. If you want to see this kind of flow around a ball, you don't want an object that's that big. It's too big. You can't, viscosity in the air is so small it can't order the airflow around an object that big at any reasonable speed. So go to tiny objects. So this is the story not of baseballs really, but of bacteria, dust particles, things that are just tiny and for which viscosity is in a position to keep the flow orderly around them. In that case, you get, I'll remind you again, you get this interesting pattern of pressures around the object. You get where the air encounters the object. It's coming in from, in this picture. It's flowing in from the left. When it hits the ball, the pressure rises. That's the violet. As it goes around the sides of the ball, the pressure drops. That's the red. And when it goes out the back, the pressure rises again. There's actually high pressure behind the particle. And off it goes. And because of this beautifully symmetric arrangement of pressures, there's no overall force due to pressure on the ball. It's oblivious to pressure. It experiences only a different kind of drag known as viscous drag associated with the rubbing of the airflow and nothing more. And That's not a lot, but it's enough that it keeps dust particles and germs and stuff floating in the air. Not literally floating. They are still heavy objects or denser objects in the air. They're not supported by the buoyant force. They're supported by air resistance, the drag force. Okay? And also, before I forget it, to try to illustrate again to you what a drag force is and how it's different from lift, during office hours I talked about this observation that you have to have stuck your hand out a window of a fast-moving car at some point in your life. I know it's the era of air conditioning and nobody likes to put their windows down anymore. But this was part of life as a kid. Wow, look at this. When you put your hand straight out the passenger side window, flat there, you feel your hand being blown backward, right? That's pressure drag, as we'll see. That comes about because I'm going to flip to not this story, it's the next stories for balls. But that's high pressure in front, but it turns out there's no high pressure behind. And I'll come to that in a minute. Okay? But it's a drag force. It's a downstream force. Your hand gets blown towards the back seat. Okay? If you tilt your hand, however, now you can play airplane, right? Woo! Up I go, down, you know those forces? Those come not from sort of stopping the air, which is associated with drag. You're dragging the air with you by sort of stopping it. You're deflecting it when you tip your hand at an angle. And that deflecting process, the air doesn't pile up on your hand, rather it gets pushed down. If you do this, the air flows down. If you do this, the air flows up. And your hand gets pushed opposite the direction you push the air. So those are lift forces. You can make them up, you can make them down, you can make them sideways, so on. All familiar, I hope? It's your homework. Go play in a fast-moving car. Don't play in traffic. Okay. So I told you pressure drag. I mentioned pressure drag is the experience you have when you shove your hand flat out the window. Where that comes about is that now the Reynolds number is higher. It's high enough that you're in the regime in which turbulence happens. And now when the air flows past the ball, what happens at the very the air's first encounter with the ball hasn't changed much. The air still spreads out at the front of the ball and its pressure rises. That air slows down, its pressure rises, it's moving out of the way of the ball, bending away from the ball, and so the pressure up here is high. The air then tries to go around the sides of the ball, and as it does, its pressure begins to drop. It speeds up, goes to lower pressure. So far, so good. This is the story of the previous story of laminar flow was the same. And finally, the air that having reached the sort of the midpoint of the ball, and since this is a two-dimensional drawing, it's just a flat image, we're really talking about, if I had a three-dimensional ball, it's this whole ring around the middle of the ball. That's all low-pressure air, just arcing in around the ball and trying to go to the back to leave. Well, as it tries to go to the back, it has problems. And the problems don't have to do with Bernoulli's equation and stuff. They have to do with a loss of ordered energy. And just to clarify, I was asked earlier about what is ordered energy. The energy that Bernoulli's equation pays attention to does not include thermal energy. It includes the energy that's equivalent to work, that can do work. So that includes gravitational potential energy, something that's high can do work. Pressure potential energy, something that's under pressure can do work. And the third is kinetic energy, something that's moving fast can do work. Thermal energy, not so much. So the energy along a streamline, the energy per drop along a streamline, the ordered energy along that streamline is constant. It goes between the three forms. Thermal energy is out of the story until you bring in viscosity. Once you bring viscosity into the story, Bernoulli's equation isn't quite right anymore because some of that lovely ordered energy gets ground up into thermal energy. And as a result, the energy per drop is gradually decreasing as you go along a streamline because the flow is getting hotter. Is that okay? Yeah. Isn't there always viscosity? The answer is yes. There's always viscosity. In many contexts, you can just ignore it because it's not important. So up until now, I've sort of been sweeping it under the rug, but now it's going to show up where it is important. Okay? In air, the viscosity is so low you barely notice it's there. But not quite zero. So it's there. So physics is full of approximations where you try to decide what you can leave out and still get the job done. Because if you try to keep everything in your mind at once or on the sheet of paper, you're just paralyzed with complexity. So the story for this previous story here, well, I won't go back to it. The laminar flow, viscosity played almost no role in the flow itself, and we could just leave it alone. Now I got to pay attention to it for a moment. Is that okay? And where it shows up is not really around the front of the ball. It's there, but not important. Where it shows up, and it is important, is in the layers of air that are going around the back of the ball, very close to its surface. Those layers, like all the other layers, should have enough ordered energy to make it to the back of the ball and leave. They are doing the bizarre task of going from low pressure on the sides of the ball to high pressure behind the ball. They are running not into a headwind, but into a head pressure. They're burrowing into higher pressure, which seems counterintuitive. Flows like to go from high pressure to low pressure, and this is going the other way. How can it do it? Well, the flow's got high speed, so it's got the energy in the form of speed. It can do it. It can burrow into that rising pressure, and it does. But the layers very close to the ball waste some of their energy by rubbing. They're aware of the ball's surface by way of viscosity, and they rub. And they lose a little bit of their ordered energy. And as a result, they don't make it to the back of the ball. They try them and fail. They pile up. At some point, they pile up back behind the ball in that innermost layer. They come to a stop, and that pile up then creates a wedge that just breaks the whole flow away from the back of the ball. And instead of having this beautiful laminar flow of streamlines coming off the back of the ball, you have a big tumbling mess. The wake that you're familiar with, that you've seen following vehicles driving through leaves. That's a turbulent wake. You've seen it in water. A boat goes by at high speed. Boat goes by at high speed. Too many random other thoughts. I'll come back. It leaves a messy, churny white water behind it. If you go slow enough in a boat, because water has a large viscosity after all, much more than air, you can actually get a laminar wake behind a boat. So picture a canoe going very slowly through the water. It can stay laminar. If you now drag the canoe with a speedboat, it will leave a turbulent wake. But the transition between laminar and turbulent, which occurs with changing Reynolds number, is sort of within the realm of possibility for boats on water, because water's got enough viscosity to work with. The other thought that was going through my head that I want to point out is I've talked about stirring coffee or tea or whatever you want to stir. You put the milk in and give it a stir. If you go slowly with your spoon, you get laminar flow because the Reynolds number is too low. The obstacle is the spoon, but you're not making things move fast enough for inertia to be important. So you get smooth flow. You don't mix very well. But you go a little faster, and you can actually see the transition. You go fast enough, and you know the thing gets all swirly and messy. You're working your way to higher Reynolds numbers as you go faster. You're making inertia more and more important until finally viscosity says, I give up. You can have a mess if you want. And that's what you want for mixing. You want turbulence. It jumbles everything up. Laminar flow doesn't. All right? So the turbulent wake that shows up behind basically any object moving at any ordinary size object moving at any ordinary speed through air, you get a turbulent wake behind it. The layers of air right near the surface of the object don't make it to the back of the object. Those layers right near the surface of the object have a name. They're called the boundary layer. So the boundary layers, layer singular, of a flow is the one that's aware of the surface by way of viscous effects. And it varies according to the situation. But they're boundary layers. There's a boundary layer around your car as the air is going by. Right near the surface of the car, there's air that's not traveling quite at the normal speed of the flow outside because of its interaction with the car's surface. These very quickly get into areas where there are experts that deal with it. Swimsuits, some of the complexity of modern swimsuits for racing and stuff, it has to do with trying to control boundary layer behavior right there at the surface. Same with racing boats. All right. So this is life for a baseball up to about 100 miles an hour through the air. Once you go above 100 miles an hour, something extra happens, and this is where I sort of ended up last time. I'll do it right. If the air is moving fast enough past a ball, another basically unexpected thing happens, one that seems like it came from nowhere. If you look at that boundary layer that's flowing around the ball and that is having trouble getting to the back of the ball and is causing the turbulence to happen, that boundary layer is itself laminar at low speed. But if you go to high enough speed, that boundary layer itself begins to tumble, so that the flow of air in it is not so orderly, where one portion of air stays innermost, closest to the ball surface the whole way. That was true at low speed, 50 mile an hour baseball. For 50 mile an hour baseball, that innermost sheet of air flowing around the back of the ball has to do with the job all by itself, and it runs out of energy. It stops. It peels away the rest of the flow and makes a big giant wake, a wake pretty much as big around as the ball itself. But if you go faster, that innermost layer of air trips or tumbles and is replaced by the second innermost layer of air, or maybe the third most inner. They begin to play tag team. Those innermost layers of air that are part of the boundary layer begin to change places and exchange, in fact, they exchange energy so that they take turns fighting their way to the back and rubbing. And they don't, whatever's the innermost layer doesn't come to a stop as soon. It has had some opportunity to be not the innermost layer periodically, and it saves its energy. The result is, for very high speed flows around a ball, over 100 miles an hour, for baseball, you get this tag team behavior in the boundary layer. Technically, the boundary layer is itself turbulent. And when finally that tag team runs out of energy, which it still does, it leaves a smaller wake. So the wake behind a baseball moving very fast, 100 miles an hour or faster, is smaller than the wake behind a slower moving baseball. So the wake just suddenly abruptly shrinks. I think people can visualize this in a like a wind tunnel with streamers in it. You can see the wake. You speed up the airflow, the wake gets smaller. And the consequence of the wake getting smaller is the ball suddenly dragging less air behind it. It's a column of air behind the ball being dragged, being given the ball's precious momentum, but it's smaller, less mass. It doesn't slow the ball down as much. So there's an abrupt drop in the drag force exerted on the ball when it goes above a certain speed. It's able to burrow through the air better. Yeah. Does it affect mileage on cars? I don't know, but it could happen that the size of the wake in the car matters a lot. Some substantial fraction of your gas mileage, the cost of keeping the car moving, comes from dragging air with it, and you want to make that small. And so I'm always puzzled at cars that are literally box-shaped, because those are aerodynamic catastrophes. They drag with them a column of air that can even be bigger than the car's cross-section. So having a tapered back on the car, controlling the flow is important. And so some cars are designed to be aerodynamic. They're designed to create a relatively small wake behind them. What else did I want to say about this? Something else went right by my head. Oh, I was going to tell you about boundary layer control. This is a topic that comes up with airplanes, but I'll tell you at the moment anyway. Golf balls, so the context in which this matters in respect to balls is golf balls deliberately make that innermost layer, the boundary layers, tumble. They trip it. And the result is that the golf ball leaves a much smaller wake behind it once it has been dimpled than when it wasn't dimpled. So in the early days of golf, when they first went over to essentially plastic golf balls, gutta percha golf balls, they were molded smooth. And people suddenly discovered the ball didn't go, well, people know any better. The ball didn't go very far, but that's okay. They discovered the more they hit the ball, and the more they nicked it and chopped it and cut it, the farther it went, because they were basically dimpling it. Eventually, they would dimple it with a chisel, and then ultimately they started molding dimples into it. First, they were outward dimples, and now they're inward dimples, but it's the same idea. It was discovered empirically. Wow, you beat the ball up, it goes better. Wow, it's a huge effect. So that if the ball were smooth, if you go take a golf ball and you dip it in plastic or something like that and fill in all the dimples, you'll cut the distance it travels by a factor of 2 or 3. It's way harder for it to drill through the air because it will leave a great big weight behind it. The dimples really shrink the wake a lot, and so the ball goes way farther. So that's the ball story. I had hoped way back when I was writing about this stuff for the book that the fuzz on tennis balls would have the same effect. And to an extent it does, but it also increases other drag effects, viscous drag effects and stuff like that. So finally the tennis ball, it turns out, and people finally measured it, they shaved tennis balls and compared their ability to fly with the fuzz, without the fuzz. The fuzz is a net loser. It doesn't help the tennis ball go better. Where the tripping the boundary layer does reappear and is important is on airplane wings. You may well have looked out at the airplane wings and seen little fingers projecting out of the wing, little fins, and typically they look like. Those are the equivalent of dimples. They trip the boundary layer and make it tumble, and they help the air flow over the top surface of the wing all the way to the back and not break away. So they're boundary layer control effects. In the case of an airplane wing, it's not just drag that you're trying to keep under control by making small wakes. You're also trying to control lift. We'll get to lift shortly. Okay? So dimpled golf balls. That's the story for ordinary balls. But what about if a ball is spinning? So a ball that is not spinning and it's all smooth and nice and everything like that really only experiences various varieties of drag forces depending on its speed and so on. But if the ball is spinning, it loses some of the symmetric character it had when it was just a non-rotating ball moving. The direction of spin matters. And what happens with a spinning ball is the airflow around it changes, is different for the air that is moving with the rotating surface as opposed to the air that is moving against the rotating surface. So if I've got a ball, let's say it's rotating like this, as the air is coming along like that, this air is moving with the surface, and the two of them talk to each other, and they like this. Whereas the air that's on the bottom, I can't keep rotating. I'm not one of these guys that can spin the ball too. I can't even hold the stupid thing. The ball goes along. Yeah, don't have me show up on the court. This air is going against the surface. They rub. This is difficult, and the result of the flow being asymmetric is that you get two interesting effects show up. The first is known as the Magnus force. In this story, the way I've drawn it here, the air is once again coming from the left, flowing past the ball, but now the ball is rotating, and as with this arrow, it's rotating clockwise from your perspective. So if I made an animation out of this, you'd watch the ball spinning here. And the airflow that goes over the spinning ball is moving with the surface. This is good. It flows especially easily and especially fast up there because of the interactions between the flow and the flow and the surface. They establish a shape of flow in which the flow over the top is especially fast. And having turned an especially large fraction of its pressure potential energy into kinetic energy. So the pressure there is low. High-speed air, low-pressure air up there on the top of the ball. The air that went under the ball is moving against the surface. When the two talk to each other, they establish a flow pattern that is different. The flow pattern down here is especially slow and especially high pressure. It's not super high pressure, but it's high enough. So this is a high pressure flow here. You can see the streamlines got far apart, which means the air is moving slowly. Up on the top, the streamlines got close together. That means they're squirting through at high speed. So you get this asymmetric flow, and it leaves asymmetrically. It entered exactly horizontal in my picture, but it leaves having been tilted downward. This pattern, which is present in laminar flow, this assumes laminar flow. No turbulence yet. That's a second effect, which I'll come to. This breaks the symmetry of the flow, and the air ends up with a net downward movement after the spinning ball has gone by. And the result of that is that the ball has effectively pushed the air downward. It's deflected the airstream downward. The air just came along horizontally, and it leaves heading down, in principle, forever. Of course, it'll hit something and be turned back up. It doesn't go down forever in the real world. But the ball has pushed it down, and it will have pushed the ball up. This ball experiences an upward force that's at right angles to the original airflow. So it's an upward lift force. So it's lift in the upward direction, which makes it especially well named. All right? Any questions for why this force shows up? It's a real force. It's there, so you can see it happen. Associated with the same flow is there's a second force that shows up. The second force that shows up is called the wake deflection force. In the real world, balls experience turbulence. So you end up with turbulence along with the Magnus effect. And the turbulent flow, you end up with a wake because of the breaking away of the flow from the surface because of boundary layer problems. But that wake isn't symmetric either. Because of the rotation of the ball, again, clockwise, around it goes, the wake is deflected downward. So this swirling mass of air is there, but it's not heading off horizontally in the end. And pushing that wake downward, the ball pushed the wake downward, so the wake pushed the ball upward. So both of these effects occur together. They push in the same direction. In both cases, the pressure's higher on the side of the ball heading into the wind than it is on the side of the ball heading away from the wind or heading with the wind. And so you get a net push because of pressure effects. All right? Yeah. Why does this one have a wake? The two forces are technically different because this one involves the turbulence. The other one assumes no turbulence. The Magnus force assumes no turbulence. It was the only force that was talked about in most contexts. Like up until I started to do the class right and to do the book right, I had to study all this stuff. Like who does this? Most physicists don't. I don't know much about fluids actually at all. And I started discovering that, well, the Magnus force is the only one anybody ever writes about in most physics books, or at least did. But there isn't laminar flow around any reasonable, a curveball. It's not laminar flow around that thing. It's got turbulence around it. So this can't be the whole story. And if you dig deeply enough, there were articles written about this other force, the wake deflection force, in literature, but sort of unrecognized. Like they published them and no one noticed. But the people who did them studied the strength of the two effects. And this is probably the dominant one. So whereas most physics books will talk about the Magnus force as being responsible for the curveball, it's probably the wake deflection force that's the most important. The breaking away effect, because this surface is moving with the air, it helps that boundary layer move. And so the air pocket breaks away late on the side moving with the air. And it breaks away early because it rubs like crazy on the bottom. And so you get this asymmetric. Wait, Kristen? I probably said it wrong. The pressures, red is my low pressure. That's how I write low pressure. That's high speed air. The streamlines are tight together, moving fast, and the red end of the spectrum is my low pressure story. If you go back, this is particularly visible in the Magnus force. Big red, there's big low pressure on the side of the ball moving with the wind. And there is a big, relatively strong high pressure on the side moving against the wind. Okay? So this is responsible for curveballs and a variety of other things that aren't called curveballs. The classic, I mean, I'm not a, sports are not my strength. When a pitcher throws a fastball with his or her fingers tight together, they pull back on the ball as it leaves their hand. And the result is the ball is spinning, and just to illustrate, I'll use a bigger ball. The ball, as having been pitched, is spinning like this as the air goes by it. Can you picture that? Don't look at that picture because the directions are all wrong. But it's spinning like this. The air is flowing very fast on the top. That's the good side. The wind goes with it. And so the air comes across and is kicked down like that. See, I can do it like this. I'll reverse my directions. Now this is exactly what that fingers together fastball pulling back on the top is exactly matches the drawing on the screen, right? So the air that's flowing past, I need several extra hands, is deflected downward in this context. The result is that fastball experiences an upward lift force. It's not enough to support the weight of the ball against gravity, but it decreases the net force of the ball. The ball doesn't fall properly. It doesn't go down at 9.8 meters per second. It goes up somewhat less acceleration. And so to some extent, the ball hangs. So I've heard it could be called a hanging fastball. The fact that it doesn't really hang, it falls slowlier than it should. If, on the other hand, the person pitching it spreads their fingers out and doesn't pull back as much, doesn't spin the ball as fast, it doesn't experience these upward forces. And so it falls the way it's supposed to. And so that I think actually is called a sinking fastball, because it follows the arc of a falling object, whereas the other one, which is more common, doesn't. It's delayed in its fall. Is that okay? Let me try to throw one of these things. I'm going to try to pull back very hard on it as it goes to your right. Can you see it? It almost went horizontal the whole way across the room. It's falling too slowly. Can you see it hang? There's a toy here that if done right, can really make it hang. This will pull back like crazy on the ball, and I might be able to get it to curve up. Can you see it curving up? That one did definitely curved up from my perspective. This actually is how golf balls travel. A properly hit golf ball that grips the club, the golf ball gets hit from below by the club. It gets hit like this, chop, and it spins like crazy, the same way I've just described. And as a result, it experiences an upward lift force, and it arcs up. And there are apparently people who can actually make the ball do a loop-de-loop. You hit it enough that that lift force is so strong it actually goes up until finally it's vertical, and then it goes over your head backwards because of lift. Without that effect, without that lift, so the golf ball flies down the field. It does not travel in the arc of a falling object. On the moon it does, but on Earth, it's flying. It's deflecting the air downward because of its rotation, and off it goes like that. Okay? How you spin the ball determines which way the lift force is. This lift force I've been talking about so far is straight up, and the name lift sounds perfect. But you can tilt it at any kind of angle, depending on which way you spin the ball. And curveballs and sliders, and I never remember which one's which, you're curving on a certain axis. And the ball experiences lift not upward, but to the side. And it can curve this far between the pitch and home plate. And unless the batter can figure out that the ball is going to curve, it's very hard to hit. Surely they're watching the pitcher to see what the pitcher does with their hands, because then they can anticipate the spinning of the ball and therefore which way it deflects. Is that okay? This shows up in all the other sports too. You can curve, bend it like Beckham. How do you bend a soccer ball? travel in a crazy arc, you spin it. And you get these lift forces that deflect it. The other possibility is not to spin a ball. Balls are not perfect objects in the sense they're not perfect spheres. They have structure on them. And if you deliberately don't spin a ball, these structures don't have any way of averaging out with time by presenting all the possibilities to the onrushing air. Instead, certain defects on the surface of the ball may sort of sit there interacting with the air. So for example, if I threw this beach ball, it's got a the filling knob piece here. When air goes over that filling piece, the boundary layer is going to trip. That's a single dimple on a golf ball with only one dimple. That flow across that dimple, it's going to trip. This boundary layer will be able to go farther toward the back of the ball than any of the other boundary layers here, there, and everywhere. So the ball is going to have a smaller wake on this side than anywhere else. Well, if the wake is asymmetric, that means the ball will have pushed the air unevenly to one side or the other, and this ball will experience a lift force to some direction. I'd have to think hard to figure out which way, but it will move. It will move toward or away from that dimple. Can't think which. Probably toward the dimple. All right? So a ball that's thrown without much spin so that it presents its defects beautifully to the air and develops weird patterns behind it that are sustained will dither to the side unpredictably. And this is the origin of knuckleballs. The knuckleball is the legitimate baseball throw where you throw the ball without spinning it at all. And it's very hard to do. It's so much easier to pull back on part of it and actually give it some spin. So you throw without any spin, and that will dither because it's presenting its dimples. All those stitches then act to change the airflow around the ball and cause it to be pushed to the side one way or the other in an unpredictable way. Then there also, how you hold the ball relative to the stitches matters because even if you do spin it, if you spin it, there are different patterns you can give the rushing air depending on how you hold the ball when you throw it that will give it pushes to one side or another. So knuckleball is the official rule. Spitball is the cheater's version of a knuckleball. If you can't not spin it legitimately, just lubricate it so that you can't spin it because it's slippery. Or you can nick the ball, which is everybody's favorite thing to do and not get caught. If they can, you put a bad spot on it deliberately, then it will get sucked towards the bad spot. All right? So that's why the balls are always getting changed out. Look at it, up, nick, out it goes. All right? Floater serves and volleyball, same idea, no spin. Okay, I think I've done decent justice to balls. Any questions about balls in air? All right. Let me shift over then to airplanes. And airplanes, finally, sort of everything else is kind of leading up to airplanes in the sense that airplanes are the ultimate aerodynamic machine. Rockets are maybe cooler than airplanes, but rockets don't care about the air. The airplanes, it's all about interactions between the plane and the air. And so the issue to talk about is, for one, is how does the plane manage to keep itself up there? It is heavier than air. It's not held up by buoyant force. This is not a dirigible or a blimp. It's heavier than air, and yet it manages to stay up. And it does this because it flies in the air. It takes the passing air, and the air has to pass it. It can't be stationary. The air has to pass it, and it deflects that air down. And it does that with a combination. We've seen that a spinning ball can do this, but a plane has much easier time of it. A plane's much more designed to fly, experience lift forces, whereas a ball wasn't really designed to get lift forces. It's just you could pull it off if you're tricky. Okay, so my little opening question, I've gotten lazy about asking these questions. If you've ridden in a jet airplane, you're sitting in the seat adjacent to the engine. You can see the engine perhaps out the window, and the air is passing by this plane from your inertial perspective very fast. I mean, yeah, for someone on the ground, they're looking up, they see the plane going by at 600 miles an hour. For you in the plane, in a different inertial frame of reference, everything around you is heading back, except in the plane, is heading backwards the other way at 600 miles an hour. So you okay with that perspective? You're at rest, The plane is at rest around you, and you see the air, if it were colored, you'd watch it go by at 600 miles an hour. Okay? The question is, how fast is the air traveling in the inlet duct for that engine? So not far away, but rather the engine has this great big mouth, this cylindrical mouth that's taking the air in. And the air enters there, and there are blades and all kinds of stuff that are spinning so fast you can't see them right now. But right there before the air goes into those blades, how fast is it traveling? You okay with the question? I made it long-winded, but I did. How many say A, it's traveling much faster than 600 miles an hour? How about much slower than 600 miles an hour? And how about 600 miles an hour? Okay, it's light voting. It must be, I would say it might be a primary, but who knows anymore. All right. I tell you, it's traveling very slow. The air has slowed down to enter that jet engine. Well, how did that happen? And it's going into, that front end of that engine is called a diffuser. The air is going into there, spreading out and slowing down. It's converting its kinetic energy, the 600 mile an hour kinetic energy has, into pressure potential energy. That's high pressure air entering. And this ultimately, just as a random harangue here, you may have heard all these discussions about the turnover of air in a jet engine, in a jet plane, that they don't turn over the air enough, or they do, or you get sick in a plane because they recycle the air and all that stuff. Well, the handling of air in an airplane is very complicated because the air outside the plane at high altitude, it's very low density and pressure. We know that because of the atmosphere story. There's not much atmosphere overhead to support, so that air way up there doesn't have much weight on top of it. It's got low density and low pressure. That's okay with everybody so far? It also turns out that's very cold air. It's like 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. It's really cold. So you don't want to, it's low pressure and density. You can't breathe it. It's really cold. It's a real disaster. To get the air for you to breathe, they actually take it out of the engines, not with fuel in it, but they use the Bernoulli's effects and stuff like that to get that air to the point where you want it, which is at the right temperature and the right pressure and density for humans. So it's a long story. It's actually got more complication even than that because there's a temperature issue that's even more exotic. But we won't get to be able to talk about that until I talk about how air conditioners work. All right. So point is, the air slows down and its pressure rises on entry to the jet engine. That's not one of the reasons why that's important is because the engine needs high pressure, dense air to carry out combustion, get the job done. This is why jet engines can fly higher than propeller planes driven by reciprocating engines. Car engines, cars don't work at 30,000 feet. The air's too thin. They can't run the engine well. A jet engine can because the jet engine is packing the air more tightly using Bernoulli effects. All right, rather than spend my day on that, I'll try to give you a basic idea of how a plane flies before calling it a day and going into the exam. The airplane uses the air to support itself. It's deflecting the passing airstream downward, pushing down on it, and the air in turn pushes up on it. That statement is what's called the Newtonian view of airplane flight. That you push the air down, it pushes you back up. Newton's laws, hey, we're done. And some people sort of subscribe to that as like the whole story. And then there are other people who subscribe to a Bernoullian point of view, which is that there are weird pressure effects that occur above and below the wings, which I'll talk about. And there's overall an upward push on the wing due to differences in pressure between high pressure below the wing and low pressure above the wing. And the Bernoullians will say that that's the whole story. In fact, it's a tempest in a teapot. The Newtonian view of push down on it, it pushes back, and the Bernoullian view that we got pressure differences, they lift. It's the same exact story. It's just looked at differently. So it's the six blind people around an elephant. They all describe it differently. It's still the same elephant. Okay. So key question here, the one that I'll give you a basic start on, is how does the airplane support itself in the air? And the answer is, let's go here, is that it obtains a substantial lift force from the passing air. And unlike the ball, which is this symmetric spherical thing, the airplane's wings are carefully crafted to obtain lift forces. Part of that craft comes in the shape of the wing itself. If we were to slice through this wing here and look at it, it would be somewhat asymmetric. It's an asymmetrical slice. The one I've got up here is drawn up there looks very symmetric, but in real planes, typically it's not quite so symmetric. The top and bottom surfaces are somewhat different. So it's partly the shape of that surface, those surfaces, and also their tilt, what's known as their angle of attack. So when the plane is moving to our left, the air then is rushing at it toward our right. And so if we're on the plane, the air is rushing toward the right, toward the plane. This is a slice through the wing of the plane. I haven't shown you the body of the plane. You're out here. Here's the body of the plane. We've sliced through it here. Only hypothetically, the plane's safe. Everybody's good. And what's happening is the air is flowing around this sliced wing in a really complicated way. What's happening is there is a division. This is the division line here. Airflow above that goes over the wing, and airflow below it goes under the wing. Let's follow the airflow. Well, first under the wing, just because it's easier. This airflow comes along. It basically encounters the surface like the front end of a ball, and it bends away from the surface, and that, as usual, requires that the pressure be high at the surface to push the air away so that the air accelerates away from the surface. So this is high pressure air. The air has slowed down a lot. The air in this area is much slower than if the plane was traveling 600 miles an hour, that air might only be traveling 300 miles an hour. It's much slower. Pressure is much higher than the ordinary pressure of that air in the vicinity of the plane. And so the air bends away and ultimately leaves the plane. Airflow under the wing. How about airflow over the wing? The airflow over the wing makes this tight bend around the front portion of the wing, the part of the wing that first encounters the air and is called the leading edge. So the air bends around that leading edge pretty fiercely, and in doing so, it's accelerating strongly toward the wing surface. Well, for that to happen, for the air to accelerate toward the wing surface, the pressure at the wing surface has to be pretty low so that the surrounding air can push the air toward the surface and make it accelerate toward the surface. So there's a very low pressure over the top of the wing near its leading edge. That's represented by the red end of the spectrum, low pressure. So you've got high pressure below the wing, low pressure above the wing. That's a pressure imbalance on the wing. The wing is pushed from high pressure to low pressure. It develops a lift force, and that's what I've illustrated here with the arrow. It's got a strong upward push because of this pressure imbalance. At the same time, it develops a small downstream push called induced drag that is not, it's not viscous drag. It's not the rubbing of the air on the wing. It is not pressure drag. There's no air pocket. There's no turbulent wake. In a well-designed plane working well, there's a very small turbulent wake behind the plane, almost none. It's kind of amazing. It is possible. A ball is known as a blunt object. So is a boxy car. These are objects that end up with turbulent wakes behind them because they just don't handle the flow of air well, particularly from the midpoint to the back. An airplane is an aerodynamic streamline object. Its job is to control the airflow as best it can to leave as small a wake as possible, and it leaves very little wake. So this wing experiences almost no viscous drag, well, small viscous drag, small pressure drag, but it does experience induced drag. The induced drag comes about because the act of deflecting the air downward gives that air some energy. And that energy has to come out of the plane, and it comes out in the form of a slowing effect known as induced drag. So in a plane that's flying at constant velocity at 30,000 feet, it's deflecting enough air down every second to give away all of the downward momentum it's being given by the gravity. Gravity is pouring downward momentum into the plane. The plane succeeds in not descending. How? By giving away that momentum to the air. So the air goes down instead of the plane, and the plane stays up there at constant altitude, constant speed. All right. See you on Monday with a pencil.